November 4th, 1942, Western Desert, Egypt. A German army is backing up fast, throwing dust into the sky as it goes. Wrecked tanks sit abandoned. Burned-out trucks are left behind like trash on a highway. A once feared force is pulling away from the line it swore to hold. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel orders a full retreat from El Alamein. And here's the part most people in America never hear clearly. This collapse isn't caused by American tanks. It isn't caused by an American general. It isn't caused by American boots on the ground, because the Americans aren't even in the fight yet. 4 days later, on November 8th, U.S. forces land far to the west in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch. They run into Vichy French resistance first, not the main German desert force. Meanwhile, Rommel is already moving out, chased by a British-led army that has just done something huge. Britain and the Commonwealth break the Africa Corps at El Alamein before American ground troops face German soldiers in North Africa. But if you ask a random person decades later, a lot of them will say the same name, Patton. That's not because Americans didn't fight hard in North Africa. They did. They paid for lessons in blood, especially later in Tunisia. But El Alamein, the battle that smashes Rommel's ability to threaten Egypt, belongs to the British 8th Army under Bernard Montgomery. And that's the uncomfortable truth behind the story Hollywood prefers. If you want more WWII stories where the real turning points get put back in the right order, hit subscribe and keep the bell on. This channel doesn't do myths. It does receipts. To understand what Montgomery pulled off at El Alamein, you have to go back to the summer of 1942, when Britain's situation in Egypt is getting scary. Rommel has shoved British forces back across the desert again and again. The British are tired, battered, and running out of room. At one point, the front is roughly within striking distance of Alexandria. Cairo feels threatened. The Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to India and the wider empire, looks vulnerable. If Rommel breaks through at El Alamein, Egypt can fall. And that's not just a bad headline. That's a strategic disaster. The Middle East oil fields are exposed. Britain's position around the Mediterranean starts to crack. The whole region becomes a door the Axis can push open. In London, Winston Churchill sees the danger. He knows Britain cannot afford to lose Egypt. Not politically, not militarily, not morally. So he turns to a new commander for the 8th Army, Bernard Montgomery. Now, Montgomery is not the kind of character that makes easy movie scenes. He isn't the wild, charging hero screaming at the horizon. He is controlled. He is strict. He is stubborn. He's the guy who says, "No, we're not doing it yet," when everyone else is begging for action. Churchill wants something dramatic, something fast, something bold, something that looks like victory. Montgomery offers something less exciting, but more real: preparation, training, logistics. And then a battle of attrition, where numbers and organization matter more than style. It's not flashy, it's not romantic, but in the desert in 1942, it's exactly what Britain needs. When Montgomery takes command in August 1942, he changes the tone immediately. Before him, British attacks in the desert often come in pieces. Units go in as they arrive, without full coordination. Rommel, who is sharp and aggressive, punishes that. He doesn't need to beat a whole army at once if he can beat it in chunks. Montgomery refuses to play that game. He won't launch a major offensive until he has overwhelming strength and a plan his troops can actually execute together. Not just infantry, not just tanks. Everything: infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and air power working as one system. He drills. He reorganizes. He enforces standards. He builds confidence the hard way, through repetition and discipline. And most of all, he stockpiles ammunition, fuel, spare parts, tanks, artillery shells. Everything you need to fight for days without praying the supply trucks show up on time. This is the kind of war-winning work that rarely gets a hero close-up shot. But it decides campaigns. It also frustrates Churchill because Churchill wants movement now. Churchill wants headlines now. Montgomery basically tells him, in polite military language, "The offensive will happen when I'm ready, not when you're impatient." In the desert, that patience is lethal because Montgomery understands the one thing that can beat Rommel at this stage of the war, forcing him into a fight he cannot afford. Rommel's army in North Africa is tough, but it's stretched. Supplies have to cross dangerous sea routes and long desert roads. Fuel is always a problem. Ammunition is precious. Replacement tanks and parts aren't endless. Montgomery doesn't need to out-genius Rommel in a fast-moving chess match. He needs to set up a grind where Rommel's shortages become a trap. By October 1942, the change is visible. Even German observers can tell the British are acting differently. The defenses are strengthened with purpose. Artillery is concentrated. The whole front feels like it's being prepared for something heavy. And Montgomery has built a crushing advantage. The British and Commonwealth forces now have large numbers of tanks, over 1,000 by many accounts, plus a significant number of American-built Shermans in the mix. Those Shermans matter because they bring reliable firepower and can engage German armor more effectively than many older models. But it's not just tanks. Artillery is everywhere, planned and organized, ready to fire in mass. Guns are registered on known targets. Fire plans are built to support infantry movement and shred counterattacks. In the sky, British air power holds the upper hand. The RAF and Allied air forces work to keep the Luftwaffe under pressure and to hammer Axis supply and movement when possible. Air superiority doesn't just look good on a map. It changes what the enemy can risk. And the biggest advantage of all is the one most people ignore: sustainment. Montgomery has fuel and ammunition for a long fight. Rommel does not. His forces are short on fuel for big maneuvers and limited in the reserves needed for a drawn-out battle. That means every counterattack costs him something he can't easily replace. Every day of heavy fighting leans against him harder. Montgomery is building a fight where time itself becomes a weapon. Now the front at El Alamein isn't a wide-open playground like earlier parts of the Desert War. The terrain and minefields help narrow the battlefield. That makes it harder for Rommel to pull off his favorite move: fast, sweeping mobility, hitting weak points, turning flanks. Montgomery wants Rommel pinned in a space where superior Allied firepower can be applied over and over until the structure breaks. And here's the key: Montgomery isn't chasing a perfect moment for glory. He is manufacturing inevitability. He's betting that if he hits hard enough, long enough, with enough coordination, Rommel will be forced to spend the very resources he can't replace: fuel, tanks, experienced crews, the ability to maneuver. Once those are gone, retreat is the only option left. Then, on the night of October 23, 1942, the waiting ends. The desert is quiet for a moment, and then the British guns open up. Not a few shells, not a warning barrage. A massive, coordinated artillery strike that signals exactly what kind of battle this will be. Not elegant, not cinematic, systematic. And the moment those guns start firing, Rommel is no longer fighting the war he prefers. He's stepping into the war Montgomery prepared for him. The night of October 23, 1942 doesn't feel like a charge or a cinematic breakthrough. It feels like an industrial machine switching on. Across the El Alamein line, British and Commonwealth artillery fires in mass. Hundreds of guns hit pre-planned targets again and again, not as random chaos, but as a controlled process. Strong points get hammered, known gun pits get smashed, communication lines get cut. Movement corridors get turned into death zones. This is not a raid. It is a demolition job. Then the infantry goes forward, not in a wild sprint, in steps, in lanes, in formation. Engineers move with them because the ground is seeded with mines. The minefields aren't a side problem. They are the problem. They slow everything down. They force men to work under fire, cutting paths through wire and explosives so armor can follow. It's slow, brutal work. And it's exactly what Montgomery planned for. Earlier in the Desert War, British attacks sometimes felt rushed, units pushing in before the whole system was ready. Rommel loved that. He could catch pieces of the British army exposed and tear them up with quick counterblows. At El Alamein, the British aren't giving him those clean openings. They are moving with artillery cover, tight control, and a clear order of priorities. Clear the lanes, take the positions, hold the gains, repeat. It doesn't make a heroic poster, it makes progress. Rommel's men fight hard like they always do. German and Italian troops defend mine belts and fortified points with discipline, and their anti-tank guns still bite. But they are now stuck inside a kind of fight that punishes shortage. Every defensive stand costs ammunition. Every counterattack costs fuel. Every day costs vehicles and men they can't easily replace. And Rommel's side is already short. This is the desert, but the real battlefield is the supply situation. Montgomery has built his plan around that reality. He doesn't need to win in one dramatic punch. He needs to keep pressure on until the Axis runs out of options. Over the next days, the pattern becomes clear. Artillery pounds a section of the line. Infantry advances to take it. Engineers clear mines so armor can move. Tanks and infantry work in cooperation instead of drifting into separate fights. When resistance is strong, the British don't gamble everything. They consolidate, bring up guns, and grind forward again. It's methodical on purpose. Rommel tries to answer the way he usually answers, counterattacks. He pushes his remaining armor into the fight, trying to hit the British where they are stretched, trying to restore mobility and force a mistake. In the desert, that approach has saved him before, but now counterattacking isn't just dangerous. It's expensive. The British have more tanks. They have thick artillery support. They have air cover that makes large movements harder to hide. And they have the fuel and ammo to keep the pressure constant. So every Axis counterattack burns what little maneuver power is left. German crews can still fight brilliantly. That isn't the issue. Skill isn't the issue. The issue is arithmetic. When one side can replace losses and the other side can't, talent starts to get smothered by math. A good crew can knock out a tank. A great crew can knock out two. But if more tanks keep showing up and your fuel keeps shrinking, the fight turns into a countdown. By around October 26th, 3 days in, Rommel can see what is happening. This is not a quick battle that ends with a dramatic decision by noon. It's a squeezing battle, a pressure battle. It's built to keep him engaged while his supplies bleed away. And there's another problem Rommel can't fix: the air situation. British and Allied aircraft aren't just a background detail. They help control the tempo. When Axis forces try to shift units, they risk being spotted. When they try to resupply, they risk being hit. When they try to rest, they still feel hunted. In desert warfare, that matters. You can't hide a lot of vehicles on flat ground. You can't move big columns without being noticed. And once fuel becomes scarce, even moving to avoid pressure becomes a gamble. Rommel's army is being forced to fight in place. That's exactly what Montgomery wants, because Montgomery does not want a chasing match where Rommel's tactical instincts can create surprises. Montgomery wants a structured battle with organized firepower and controlled movement, where superior resources can be applied again and again. This is why people who only understand war through movies often misunderstand El Alamein. They expect the big moment to happen fast. They expect the genius move. They expect the dramatic encirclement. What they get instead is the slow sound of a superior system tightening its grip. Day by day, British and Commonwealth units push forward, clearing positions, widening lanes, and wearing down defenders who cannot fully recover. And Rommel's choices get uglier. If he counterattacks, he loses tanks and fuel he cannot replace. If he does not counterattack, the line gets chewed apart piece by piece. And hovering over all of it is the political pressure from above. Rommel is not fighting this battle in a vacuum. He answers to Hitler's expectations. Orders from Berlin are not always based on the reality in the desert. Rommel knows the truth on the ground. He knows his fuel limits. He knows the condition of his infantry divisions. He knows the condition of his tank fleet. He knows what happens if he keeps committing his last armor into repeated clashes. Even if his men fight like lions, they cannot fight without fuel. As the battle drags on, Axis tank strength drops. Vehicles break down. Replacement parts are scarce. Crews get worn out. Units that were once sharp become patched and strained. The defensive network that looked solid on a map starts to fray. Montgomery keeps doing what he promised he would do. He doesn't chase drama. He creates certainty. He keeps the weight on. By late October, prisoners and battlefield reports make the same point over and over. The Axis is being forced into a kind of battle it cannot sustain. Even when German units score local successes, they can't turn them into a wider recovery. They don't have the fuel and reserves to convert punches into a new situation. The British do. And that difference, more than any single weapon, is what changes the direction of the Desert War. The fighting continues into the end of the month. The losses mount. The strain becomes visible. The axis begins to look less like a spring and more like a brittle bar under pressure. Then the calendar flips toward November, and Montgomery prepares the move that will decide whether all this grinding finally turns into a break. Not a reckless rush, a concentrated thrust designed to punch through a weakened point once the enemy has been bled down far enough that he cannot seal the gap. This is where the entire logic of Montgomery's battle points. And Rommel can feel it coming, because his armored strength is shrinking fast, his infantry is battered, and his fuel situation is turning from bad to crippling. The room for improvisation is disappearing. The desert is about to change roles. Rommel, the man who spent so long driving others backward, is about to be the one looking over his shoulder, wondering if the next Uderer is the one that cracks the line for good. And when that crack comes, it won't just threaten his front, it will threaten the survival of his whole army. By the start of November 1942, Rommel's situation is sliding from dangerous into impossible. The Axis line at El Alamein has been punished for days. Tanks have been lost. Vehicles have been chewed up. Infantry formations are exhausted and thinned out. Ammunition stocks are strained. And the fuel problem, always the fuel problem, has gotten worse with every forced counterattack and every movement under pressure. This is the point Montgomery has been aiming for the whole time. Not a quick win, a breaking point. On November 2nd, Montgomery launches the attack meant to finish the job. Operation Supercharge. It is not a clever trick. It is not a surprise in the Hollywood sense. It is a concentrated armored push supported by heavy firepower aimed at shattering what remains of the Axis ability to hold a continuous line. By now, Rommel's operational tank strength has fallen drastically. His forces are no longer able to respond the way they did earlier in the Desert War, when German armor could shift fast and strike hard at exposed points. At El Alamein, the room to maneuver has been squeezed out of him, and the resources needed to improvise have been drained. So when the British and Commonwealth drive goes in with focus and weight, the Axis can't do what it used to do. It can't seal the breach. It can't mount a sustained counterattack. It can't trade losses and expect to recover. The line begins to split. Units start to pull apart. Pockets of resistance keep fighting. But the cohesion, the thing that makes a defense more than scattered bravery, starts to fail. Some positions hold for a time. Others collapse quickly. The effect spreads. Rommel sees the truth. If he stays, his force risks being destroyed in place. He asks for permission to withdraw. Hitler refuses. Orders come down demanding a stand to the last man, a rigid command that ignores the physical reality of the desert. But Rommel is not a man who confuses obedience with wisdom. He understands what those orders mean on the ground. If he obeys fully, the Afrika Korps does not just lose, it gets erased. So Rommel makes the choice that saves what can be saved. He disobeys and orders retreat anyway. On November 4th, the Axis begins pulling back in earnest, abandoning equipment and leaving behind what cannot be carried. Wrecks and scattered supplies mark the path. A force that once pushed toward Cairo is now running west, trying to keep its last tanks moving and its last columns intact. Montgomery's 8th Army pursues. This is the payoff to the unglamorous plan. Rommel is no longer an offensive threat. He is no longer choosing the battlefield. He is reacting, trying to survive, trying to keep the retreat from becoming a total rout. And in strategic terms, the effect is huge. Egypt is secured. The immediate threat to the Suez Canal is removed. The Middle East is no longer hanging by a thread. The Mediterranean theater changes shape because Britain is no longer fighting with its back to the canal. This is why Churchill treats the moment like a turning point. On November 10th, he tells the House of Commons, "This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning." That line is tied to what has just happened in Egypt, a major Allied land victory against German forces, a victory that proves the Axis can be beaten on the ground through disciplined preparation and overwhelming, coordinated power. And then, 4 days after Rommel starts his retreat, Operation Torch hits the shores of Morocco and Algeria on November 8th. American troops land in a massive amphibious operation, bold, complex, and dramatic. It makes for striking headlines and memorable images, but the early fighting is mainly against Vichy French forces, who resist briefly before the political situation shifts and they stop. Here's the key point people often miss when the story gets simplified. Torch is important, but it does not cause Rommel's defeat at El Alamein. Rommel is already beaten and already retreating from Montgomery when the Americans come ashore. That sequence matters. El Alamein breaks the Axis offensive in Egypt. Torch opens a new front that helps trap Axis forces in North Africa later. Both matter, but they are not the same event, and they do not happen in the order popular culture often implies. Over time, the narrative drifts. American newsreels naturally focus on American landings, fresh troops, new equipment, the shock of U.S. entry into ground combat in the region. The story sold to a home audience is simple and uplifting. America arrives, the tide turns. Meanwhile, El Alamein is often framed as a British defensive success, important but not always explained as the decisive blow it truly is against Rommel's ability to threaten Egypt. The context fades. Then later, as the campaign moves into Tunisia in 1943, American forces become a major ground presence. Those battles are real, and the learning curve is harsh. U.S. troops fight Germans directly, and the cost is not small. The Allies eventually force the Axis out of North Africa completely, but those later campaigns build on the strategic situation El Alamein creates. Because once Montgomery breaks Rommel's offensive strength, North Africa is no longer a place where the Axis is driving toward the Suez. It becomes a place where the Axis is being pushed and squeezed. And popular memory often rewards what looks most dramatic: fast-moving operations, big personalities, scenes that fit cleanly into a 2-hour film. Montgomery's victory is the opposite of that. It is logistics, training, and a controlled, grinding battle that turns tactical brilliance into something useless because it is starved of fuel and replacements. Rommel's own assessments, as well as other German comments recorded after the fact, point to the same core reality. The Axis is beaten by systematic Allied superiority, intelligently applied, not by one lucky break, not by a single trick, but by a prepared force using its advantages in the most disciplined way possible. And that truth keeps showing up in serious history, even when it doesn't break through pop culture. Military historians routinely treat El Alamein as a major turning point of 1942 because it removes the Axis threat to Egypt and triggers a long retreat. Official accounts also recognize that the British victory at El Alamein happens before American troops enter the theater in Torch, and that later operations build on the strategic shift it creates. But then comes the popular version. In 1970, the movie Patton hits audiences hard. It's a powerful film, and it locks a certain picture into the public mind. North Africa as an American stage, where British forces are supporting characters and where the decisive energy comes from American drive. El Alamein appears, but it doesn't sit at the center of the story the way it sits at the center of the actual timeline. The result is not that every detail is a lie. The result is that emphasis and context get bent until the real sequence becomes blurry. And once that blur settles in, it becomes the default lesson. Textbooks simplify. Pop culture reinforces. The same impression repeats for decades. America arrives. America turns the tide. America defeats Rommel. But that is not what happens in November 1942. What happens is this: Montgomery's 8th Army fights and wins the decisive battle at El Alamein. From late October into early November 1942, Rommel begins retreating on November 4th. Operation Torch lands on November 8th. 4 days after that retreat is already underway. The chronology is not complicated. The desert victory that breaks Rommel's offensive power is British and Commonwealth. American forces contribute significantly to finishing the North African campaign later, and that contribution is real. It does not need to be inflated by sliding El Alamein into the wrong place or treating it as a side note. In fact, the honest story is stronger. Britain holds when it has to hold. It rebuilds when it has to rebuild. And it wins a grinding professional victory that changes the entire theater before American ground troops even arrive in that fight against the Germans. Then America lands, expands the war, takes on major battles, learns fast, and helps drive the Axis out of Africa completely. That's the real arc. And it should be told that way because it respects what actually happened. El Alamein wasn't glamorous. It was definitive. It was the kind of battle Hollywood struggles to film because the hero moment is spread across planning, discipline, firepower, and patience. But those are exactly the ingredients that win real wars. So when you hear the desert story told like a simple legend, Patton beats Rommel and saves the day, remember the dust clouds on November 4th, 1942, when Rommel is already retreating from El Alamein. Remember that Britain and the Commonwealth did the breaking. America arrived shortly after and helped finish the job. History doesn't need a rewrite. It needs the order put back the way it actually was. Because the battle Britain won in 1942, before America even arrived, was the one that turned the North African War from a nightmare into a pursuit. And the truth, unglamorous but undeniable, is that Montgomery's method worked. He didn't win with a movie scene. He won with inevitability.